6 months after we scattered my grandfather's ashes in the bluebonnets he loved, I caught an HOA crew bulldozing the exact spot. Diesel fumes choked the air. Their excavator crushed limestone our family's owned since 1943. I ran out yelling. The foreman laughed. "Sue us, cowboy." Then Victoria Pemberton arrived, HOA president, white Mercedes, plow and $200 Louboutin heels clicking on my dirt. She glanced at Grandpa's memorial stone and sneered, "This eyesore needs to go anyway." I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I traced their pipeline back 12 miles, bought the underground spring feeding all 400 homes in her subdivision, and on July 4th, under a sky of fireworks, I turned the master valve. Now 1,200 Karens are begging this rancher for every drop. And I'm just getting started. Comment your craziest HOA revenge story. Mine ends with them crawling. My name's Dalton Reed, and 6 months ago I inherited a war I never wanted to fight. When Grandpa died last winter, he left me Mockingbird Ranch, 240 acres of Texas Hill country paradise with a natural spring that's fed our cattle since 1943. I'm a hydraulic systems engineer, spent 20 years fixing pipeline problems in oil fields. Never planned on ranching, but after my divorce went nuclear, this place felt like salvation. The morning routine became my therapy. Coffee on the porch, listening to my border collie Buster bark at roadrunners, watching mist rise off spring water so clear you can count pebbles at the bottom. 50 gallons a minute of liquid gold flowing through limestone that's been in our family for 80 years. That peace lasted exactly 4 months. Enter Victoria Pemberton, Dallas corporate lawyer turned suburban dictator. She moved to our rural county 3 years ago, bought a mansion in the new Whispering Oaks Estates subdivision, and appointed herself HOA president before the moving truck left. Think blonde bob, designer everything, and the kind of smile that makes rattlesnakes nervous. Victoria's first campaign was modernizing our community. She got roosters banned for noise violations, filed complaints about cattle smells, lobbied for streetlights that turned our star-filled nights into suburban glare. But her masterpiece was convincing the county to reclassify working ranches as agricultural entertainment venues, basically trying to regulate us out of existence. The woman had a gift for making rural life miserable, but she also had a much bigger problem. See, Whispering Oaks was built on promises of luxury living, complete with a community well that was supposed to supply all 400 homes. Except Texas drought conditions killed that well faster than Victoria's personality killed neighborhood barbecues. Now she's got 1,200 furious residents, plummeting property values, and a serious case of buyer's remorse. That's when she discovered my grandfather's spring was still flowing strong. Victoria showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning, briefcase in hand, wearing a white blazer that probably cost more than my truck payment. She had papers claiming some 1987 easement gave her subdivision water rights through my property. Needed to install a temporary pipeline for emergency access. I asked to see the original documents. "They're with my legal team," she said, that plastic smile never wavering. I asked about compensation for permanent utility installation. "This is about community responsibility, Mr. Reed." When I said I'd need my own attorney to review everything, her mask cracked. The temperature in my kitchen seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Dalton," she said, and the way she used my first name felt like fingernails on chalkboard. "I'd hate for this to become adversarial. Sometimes the county finds issues with properties that don't cooperate with municipal improvements. Tax assessments, septic inspections, livestock violations. You'd be amazed how many problems can suddenly appear." The smell of her designer perfume couldn't mask the stench of that threat. I told her I'd think about it. She left her business card on my grandfather's hand-carved kitchen table like she was marking territory. 3 days later, I woke to diesel engines destroying the pasture where we scattered Grandpa's ashes. Victoria was there, sipping coffee from a travel mug, watching the excavation like she'd paid for front-row seats to my family's desecration. That's when she looked at his memorial stone, a simple granite marker with his name and favorite Bible verse, and called it an eyesore that needed to go anyway. The crunch of gravel under my work boots as I walked toward her had never sounded so much like a countdown timer. Victoria Pemberton had just declared war on the wrong hydraulic engineer, and she had no idea I was about to turn her entire world into a desert. Victoria's next move came exactly 1 week later, and it was pure genius. If your definition of genius includes being a sociopathic control freak with a badge-wearing brother-in-law. I was fixing fence posts when Deputy Marcus Pemberton rolled up, looking like he'd rather be getting a root canal. Small-town politics at its finest. When your sister-in-law runs the HOA, you become her personal enforcement arm whether you like it or not. Dalton, we got a complaint about your cattle contaminating the water supply, he mumbled, not quite meeting my eyes. County Health Department wants an inspection. The irony hit me like a slap. My cattle drink from the same spring Victoria wants to steal. If there's contamination, her precious subdivision residents would be guzzling it too. But logic isn't Victoria's strong suit. Behind Marcus, a white Toyota Camry pulled up. Out stepped Sandra Mills, health inspector and Victoria's tennis partner at the country club. What are the odds? Sandra emerged wearing rubber gloves and an expression suggesting my cattle were personally responsible for every plague since Egypt. This is highly irregular, I said, watching Sandra march toward my perfectly healthy Angus herd. I haven't had violations in 15 years. Someone filed a complaint, Marcus said, shifting uncomfortably. The smell of his guilt was almost as thick as the morning humidity. Claiming livestock waste is seeping into groundwater. Here's where 20 years in oilfield engineering paid off. In my business, you document everything because one missing detail can kill people. So while Sandra played photographer with my cattle, I was recording our entire conversation with the body camera I wear during equipment inspections. Sandra spent 2 hours measuring distances, testing water samples, and taking enough photos for a National Geographic special. The whole time she kept glancing toward the road where Victoria's white Mercedes sat watching like a vulture. But then came the mini twist that changed everything. After Sandra finished her dog and pony show, she pulled me aside. The crunch of gravel under our feet seemed unnaturally loud as we walked away from Marcus. Dalton, she whispered, I want you to know I found absolutely nothing wrong here. Your operation is cleaner than most municipal water treatment plants. Her voice carried the weight of someone whose conscience was finally kicking in. But Victoria, she threatened to get my department's funding cut if I don't find violations. That's when I remembered something my grandfather taught me about Texas water law. He'd dealt with similar disputes in the 70s when developers first started eyeing our area. Back then, he'd educated himself on every statute, every precedent, every loophole. Prior appropriation doctrine, he used to say, tapping his temple. First in time, first in right, boy, don't ever forget that. Turns out Grandpa's bedtime stories about legal battles were about to save my ranch. Texas groundwater law is beautifully simple. The landowner controls the water beneath his property, and agricultural use trumps municipal development every time. My family's water rights date to 1943. Victoria's subdivision didn't exist until 2021. Legally, she might as well be demanding mining rights on Mars. I called the Texas Cattle Raisers Association that evening. Their lawyer almost laughed when I described Victoria's scheme. Son, he said, what you're describing is textbook harassment of agricultural operations. We eat HOAs for breakfast. My counterpunch was swift and surgical. First, I filed a complaint with the Texas State Bar. Turns out Victoria's been practicing law without proper licensing. Her registration lapsed when she moved from corporate work to community advocacy. Representing the HOA in legal matters without active bar status, that's criminal. Second, I sent certified letters to the county documenting Sandra's conflict of interest and improper inspection procedures. I included photos of her and Victoria at the country club, plus audio of Sandra admitting she found no violations. Victoria's response was predictably hysterical. She filed harassment charges claiming I was intimidating county officials and making unfounded legal threats. The complaint described me as an unstable individual with apparent mental health issues. But Marcus delivered the paperwork with an apology that tasted like vinegar in his mouth. Dalton, this is getting out of hand, he said, standing in my kitchen where fresh coffee couldn't mask his embarrassment. Victoria's just passionate about community issues. Marcus, I replied, pouring him a cup. Your sister-in-law just tried to steal my water rights using fraudulent health complaints. That's not passion, that's felony extortion. The evening air carried the sweet scent of blooming mountain laurel as I sat on Grandpa's porch, Buster curled at my feet. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was singing its territorial song. Victoria wanted to play legal games with a hydraulic engineer who fixes broken systems for a living. Her system was about to break completely. Victoria's desperation was starting to show, and desperate people make dangerous mistakes. 3 days after my bar complaint hit her desk, she called an emergency HOA meeting. The flyers went out with blood-red letters. Urgent, dangerous rancher threatens our children. According to her notice, I was an unstable veteran with apparent PTSD, running an illegal contamination operation. I'm not even a veteran, but facts never stopped Victoria. I found out about the meeting from my neighbor Bill Crawford, who drove over with a crumpled flyer and a face full of concern. "Boy, she's got folks thinking you're some kind of terrorist," he said, the smell of Copenhagen and worry thick in his voice. The community center was packed with 200 terrified homeowners who'd been told their babies were drinking poison water. The air reeked of industrial carpet cleaner and manufactured panic. Victoria commanded the podium in a navy blazer, flanked by official-looking charts that would have impressed a Supreme Court justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we're facing a contamination crisis that threatens every family here. The Reed Ranch operates without oversight, and testing shows dangerous bacteria levels that could kill our children." She had PowerPoint slides, graphs, even photos of dead fish allegedly found downstream from my property. The presentation looked NASA official, except those contamination spikes violated basic physics. Groundwater doesn't work the way her charts suggested, and any real hydrologist would have laughed her out of the room. But suburban parents don't have geology degrees. They just heard dead children and reached for their pitchforks. Then came her nuclear option. Dr. Marcus Steinberg, flown in from Austin with wire-rimmed glasses and 3 degrees from UT. He spoke like a medical examiner describing a plague outbreak. "Based on extensive analysis," he declared, "this agricultural operation presents immediate risks to public health. I recommend emergency county intervention before we see our first casualty." The crowd erupted. Someone screamed about property values. Another demanded immediate government seizure of my death ranch. Victoria's smile was pure predator as she delivered the killing blow. "I've already contacted county commissioners about emergency eminent domain," she announced. "Sometimes private property must yield to public safety. We may have no choice but to acquire this contaminated land for immediate remediation." She wanted to steal my grandfather's ranch using fabricated death threats. But here's where Victoria made her fatal error. In her PowerPoint presentation, she'd included a photo of contaminated water samples from my spring. Except I recognized that photo. It was from a 2019 industrial spill in East Texas that made national news. She'd literally stolen disaster photos from Google Images and claimed they were from my property. The taste of pure fury was copper and electricity on my tongue. That weekend, I drove to Austin and spent 14 hours in state environmental records. Dr. Marcus Steinberg's impressive credentials had one tiny problem. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality had revoked his certification in 2019 for falsifying water reports in multiple cases. Victoria had hired a documented fraud to justify stealing my land. I also found the real 1987 easement document. The original paperwork specified emergency vehicle access during fire season only, not water extraction. It explicitly prohibited commercial utility installation or pipeline construction. Even better, the easement was granted by Judge Harold Pemberton, Victoria's own grandfather. Apparently, fraud runs in the family. My counterstrike was surgical and devastating. First, I hand-delivered Dr. Steinberg's fraud conviction records to every county commissioner, along with copies of Victoria's stolen disaster photos. Using falsified environmental data to justify government seizure is a federal crime under environmental protection laws. Second, I submitted a formal complaint to the Texas Attorney General's office documenting Victoria's pattern of fraudulent municipal harassment. Turns out she'd pulled similar schemes in 2 other counties, always targeting rural properties near her developments. But my masterstroke was calling Channel 7 investigative reporter Jennifer Walsh, who'd been following HOA corruption stories statewide. When I showed her Victoria's presentation with the stolen disaster photos, her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "This is Pulitzer material," Jennifer said, her camera operator already setting up equipment. "We go live tomorrow night." Victoria's counterpunch was pure panic. She filed an emergency restraining order claiming I was stalking her family and making terrorist threats. The petition alleged I was a dangerous military veteran suffering from combat trauma and alcohol addiction. Still not a veteran, still don't drink, but Victoria was past caring about truth. The hearing was Friday. As I sat on Grandpa's porch that evening, the sweet scent of night-blooming cereus mixing with the sound of spring water flowing over limestone, I realized Victoria had just committed suicide by media. Tomorrow night, all of Texas would learn about the HOA president who tried to steal a ranch using stolen disaster photos and a disgraced fraud scientist. Victoria Pemberton was about to become very famous for all the wrong reasons. Victoria's media meltdown hit Channel 7 at exactly 6 p.m. Thursday, and by Friday morning, she was Texas's most hated woman. Jennifer Walsh's exposé was surgical. HOA president uses stolen disaster photos to justify land grab, featured side-by-side comparisons of Victoria's fake presentation with the real 2019 industrial spill. The story included my hidden footage of Dr. Steinberg's fraudulent testimony, plus court records showing his environmental fraud convictions. But the real killer was audio Jennifer had obtained of Victoria admitting she'd do whatever it takes to acquire that property, even if we have to manufacture a crisis. By dawn, #HoKaren was trending nationally. Victoria's professional headshot became a meme template for entitled behavior. Her phone was probably ringing off the hook with death threats and interview requests. That's when she made her most desperate gamble yet. At 8 a.m., an hour before my restraining order hearing, a black Escalade crunched down my gravel driveway. Victoria emerged wearing designer sunglasses and a Hermes scarf, flanked by two sharks in $1,000 suits. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle mixed with expensive desperation. "Mr. Reed," she said, forcing that politician's smile, "I believe we can resolve this unfortunate media circus privately." She opened a leather briefcase on my porch table, revealing documents and a cashier's check that made my eyes widen despite myself. $400,000, she announced, sliding the check forward like a peace offering. Immediate cash settlement for a 10-year water access lease. No more lawyers, no more media, no more complications. The first lawyer, thin with dead shark eyes, leaned in. "Mrs. Pemberton is offering significant compensation for your discretion regarding recent misunderstandings." His partner, built like a mobster enforcer, smiled without warmth. "Of course, if litigation proceeds, our investigation team will examine certain irregularities regarding your property's compliance history. Tax assessments, septic permits, livestock violations. These things have a way of multiplying during legal discovery. Classic Victoria, bribe with one hand, threaten with the other. But what she didn't know was that I'd been expecting this visit. My doorbell camera was recording everything, and Jennifer Walsh was positioned down the road with telephoto equipment, capturing every frame of this attempted corruption. "That's quite generous," I said, pretending to study the check. The paper felt crisp between my fingers, probably more money than I'd see in 5 years of engineering work. "But I'm curious about the funding source. Didn't the news report financial problems with your subdivision?" Victoria's smile twitched like a dying fluorescent bulb. "Emergency infrastructure funds. Perfectly legitimate." That's when I remembered something from my late-night research sessions. While digging through county records about the 1987 easement, I'd stumbled across something interesting. Whispering Oaks had never received proper permits for their septic system. The developer had used a shell company to bypass environmental reviews, and the whole subdivision was built on contaminated fill dirt from a previous industrial site. "Gentlemen," I said, setting the check aside, "there's something you should know about your client's subdivision. I've been doing some research into the original development permits." Shark eyes shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Reed, we're here to discuss water access, not the septic system," I continued, watching Victoria's face carefully. "It was never properly approved by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. In fact, the whole subdivision is built on industrial fill dirt that should have been classified as hazardous waste." Victoria went pale as limestone dust. "That's impossible," she whispered. "We have all the proper documentation." "Actually, you have forged documentation," I replied, pulling out a folder I'd prepared for exactly this moment. "The real permits were never filed. Your contractor used a shell company to bypass environmental review. The contamination I mentioned? It's not coming from my cattle. It's leaching from the toxic soil under your million-dollar homes." The enforcer grabbed Victoria's arm. "Ma'am, we need to leave immediately." But Victoria had snapped. The stress of media exposure, criminal investigation, and now environmental liability had pushed her past the breaking point. "You ignorant redneck!" she shrieked, jerking away from her lawyer. "Do you have any idea what I've accomplished here? What I've built? This was nothing but empty fields and trailer trash when I arrived." Her voice rose to a banshee wail. I made this community matter. I brought class and standards to this backwards wasteland, and you want to destroy it all because you're too stupid to understand progress." Both lawyers were trying to drag her toward the Escalade now, but Victoria was beyond reason. "You people deserve to live in filth," she screamed at my house, my land, everything I represented. "Dirty animals and ignorant farmers. I should have bulldozed this whole area and started over." As their Escalade disappeared in a cloud of dust and shame, I realized Victoria Pemberton had just committed suicide by confession. The restraining order hearing lasted exactly 14 minutes, and Victoria's legal career died faster than roadkill on I-35. Judge Patricia Williams took one look at my evidence: doorbell footage of Victoria's bribery attempt, her lawyer's threats, and her spectacular racist breakdown, and dismissed every charge with the kind of judicial fury that makes attorneys wet themselves. "Mrs. Pemberton," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying 30 years of courtroom authority, "I'm forwarding this evidence to the FBI for federal witness tampering charges. You're also facing immediate disbarment for practicing law without a license." Victoria sat frozen, her Botoxed face unable to process the magnitude of her destruction. The metallic taste of pure victory filled my mouth like copper pennies. But the real earthquake hit when I got home and found EPA investigator Dr. Sarah Caspian sitting on my porch steps, her government sedan parked next to my pickup like a bad omen. The late afternoon air carried the scent of rain and bureaucratic reckoning. "Mr. Reed," she said, standing with the kind of fluid grace that suggested military training, "we need to discuss your neighbor's little environmental problem. What we've discovered is biblical." Dr. Caspian spread aerial photographs across my kitchen table, the images showing whispering oaks from above like a wound on the landscape. Red contamination zones bled across the pristine subdivision like spilled wine on white carpet. "The entire development sits on illegally dumped industrial waste," she explained, her finger tracing core sample results that read like a Satan's cookbook. "Heavy metals, petroleum derivatives, chromium compounds. It's an environmental nightmare that's been leaching poison for 3 years." The scope was breathtaking. 400 homes built on what amounted to a giant toxic waste dump, with manicured lawns and infinity pools slowly murdering everything downstream. "Here's where it gets interesting, Dr. Caspian continued, pulling out financial documents that made my engineering brain spin. "Federal environmental law holds HOA board members personally liable for contamination they knew about or should have discovered through reasonable due diligence." That's when Victoria's entire scheme crystallized like perfectly formed ice. She hadn't been trying to steal my water, she'd been desperately trying to cover up the biggest environmental disaster in county history. Her subdivision was dying from toxic poisoning, and my clean spring was her only hope of diluting the contamination long enough to escape financial annihilation. "The liability numbers are staggering," Dr. Caspian said, the sound of her pen clicking against paper punctuating each devastating revelation. "Cleanup costs start at $2.8 million. Punitive damages could reach 8 figures. And here's the kicker. Victoria and her husband personally guaranteed all HOA infrastructure bonds." She slid a document across the table. "When this contamination becomes public, property values collapse, mortgages default, and the HOA faces immediate bankruptcy. The Pembertons are liable for $4.2 million in debt." The beautiful irony was poetry. Victoria had spent 3 years terrorizing rural families about imaginary pollution while literally sitting on top of a toxic wasteland that would destroy her completely. But Dr. Caspian's next revelation changed everything. "Mr. Reed, your spring isn't just clean. It's the only uncontaminated water source within 12 miles. Every well in the subdivision shows poison levels that make Chernobyl look like a spa treatment. The county issued emergency notices today requiring immediate alternative water supplies." The power shift hit me like lightning. Victoria's community wasn't just bankrupt, it was uninhabitable without my water. The spring she'd tried to steal through fraud was now their only lifeline between survival and complete evacuation. "What's the timeline?" I asked, though I was already calculating my next moves. "EPA orders emergency remediation in 60 days, Dr. Caspian replied, packing her evidence with military precision. "No alternative water source means federal takeover and forced relocation of all residents." As her sedan disappeared down my gravel road, I stood beside the spring where my grandfather had taught me that water was life itself. Victoria would have to crawl to me now. and I was going to enjoy every second of her humiliation. The next morning, I assembled my war council around Grandpa's kitchen table, and the smell of strong coffee couldn't quite mask the electricity of impending revenge. First to arrive was Bill Crawford, my neighbor who'd been fighting HOA creep for 20 years. He brought his son Tommy, a water rights attorney whose law degree was paid for by previous battles against suburban development. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria's harassment campaign had just recruited her most experienced enemies. Dr. Sarah Caspian arrived with boxes of EPA evidence that made my kitchen look like a federal crime scene. Behind her came my secret weapon, Maria Santos, a UT hydrologist who'd worked with Grandpa during the 1980s water wars. Maria had silver hair, steel-gray eyes, and the kind of sharp intelligence that could dissect legal documents like a coroner examining corpses. "Boys," Maria said, spreading topographical maps across the scarred wooden table, "what we have here is hydraulic checkmate." The maps revealed something beautiful. My spring was fed by an underground aquifer that flowed 12 miles east, directly beneath Victoria's toxic subdivision. But geology had played the perfect trick. A limestone shelf formation meant my water source was completely isolated from their contamination uphill. "Your grandfather chose this location like a master chess player," Maria explained, the satisfaction clear in her weathered voice. "The aquifer flows west to east, and you're sitting at the source. Even if we wanted to contaminate your water with their poison, physics won't allow it." Tommy leaned forward, his lawyer brain already calculating leverage. "So legally, Dalton controls the only clean water that could supply the subdivision?" "Better," Maria smiled with the predatory satisfaction of someone who'd spent decades fighting developers. "Under Texas prior appropriation law, he can charge whatever the market will bear. And with EPA's 60-day evacuation deadline, that market just became very seller-friendly." But here's where my engineering background provided the perfect insight. I'd spent months researching Victoria's subdivision during our legal battle, and I discovered something that even EPA hadn't found yet. Their backup well system had been sabotaged by the original contractor to hide contamination evidence. "There's something else," I said, pulling out drilling records I'd obtained through public information requests. "Victoria's subdivision has 3 emergency wells that were supposedly drilled as backup water sources. Except the contractor deliberately drilled them into contaminated zones to make the main system look clean by comparison." Dr. Caspian's eyes widened as she examined the documents. "This is evidence of deliberate environmental fraud. If the contractor was paid to hide contamination, that's federal conspiracy." The plan that crystallized was beautiful in its ruthless simplicity. Phase 1. Tommy would establish my family trust as the sole emergency water supplier, filing claims on both my original spring and the secondary source on the 40-acre tract I'd quietly purchased. This gave me monopoly control over every clean water source within 15 miles. Phase 2. We'd offer Victoria a water lease at crisis rates, $60 per 1,000 gallons, with a 50,000-gallon monthly minimum that would generate $300,000 annually. The contract included environmental compliance clauses and my absolute right to terminate service for any violation. But Phase 3 was my masterpiece. Maria had discovered that Texas conservation law allowed private landowners to establish protective easements that could restrict development on adjacent properties. If Victoria accepted my lease, I could legally prevent any future subdivision expansion within a 3-mile radius of my springs. "It's brilliant," Tommy said, admiration clear in his voice. "You're not just solving their water crisis, you're building a legal fortress around your land that no future HOA can penetrate." The technical infrastructure would require a main pipeline from my spring to their subdivision entrance, with individual metered connections for each home. Installation costs would run $250,000 upfront, which Victoria's community would pay as a system access fee. But my engineering coup de grace was designing the system with remote shut-off valves controlled from my property. Any lease violation, any attempt to steal water or bypass metering, and I could kill their entire supply with a smartphone app. As golden afternoon light streamed through my kitchen windows, illuminating the contracts that would remake our entire county, I felt Grandpa's spirit in the room. He'd taught me that water was life, and controlling life meant protecting everything you loved. The sweet irony was perfect. Victoria had tried to steal my heritage through lies and intimidation. Now she'd pay me a fortune for survival privileges while funding the conservation trust that would protect rural Texas from future suburban invasion. Dr. Caspian gathered evidence files with obvious satisfaction. When Victoria sees these terms, she's going to explode. When Victoria sees these terms, I corrected, watching crystal clear spring water flow past my window, she's going to sign them, because the alternative is federal evacuation and personal bankruptcy. Tomorrow, Victoria Pemberton would learn what it felt like to beg a rancher for mercy, and I was going to savor every humiliating second. Victoria's desperation reached psychotic levels when the EPA story went viral, and her response was like watching a cornered rattlesnake strike at everything that moved. The contamination scandal exploded across Texas media by Tuesday morning. Channel 7's follow-up exposed how 1,200 residents had been drinking poison for 3 years, while their HOA president covered up environmental felonies. Property values in Whispering Oaks didn't just drop, they cratered like a meteor impact. Homes that sold for $800,000 suddenly couldn't find buyers at $200,000. But Victoria wasn't surrendering without scorching the earth beneath my feet. First came the private investigators, 2 ex-cops from Houston who showed up Wednesday morning claiming to be environmental consultants. I caught them photographing my house from the tree line, their telephoto lenses glinting in the morning sun like sniper scopes. When I approached with Grandpa's shotgun, they scrambled back to their rental car faster than cockroaches when the lights come on. The acrid smell of their cigarette smoke lingered in my air long after they disappeared. But Victoria's real masterpiece was the character assassination campaign she launched Thursday. Flyers appeared throughout the county featuring my divorce photos stolen from court records, with headlines like, "Unstable rancher threatens families." One showed me at my ex-wife's house returning my tools, captioned, "Stalker terrorizes innocent woman." Another featured me having a single beer with Bill Crawford, labeled, "Alcoholic conspirator plots community destruction." The lies were so outrageous they bordered on performance art. Meanwhile, Victoria was leveraging every political connection she'd bought during 3 years of suburban empire building. County Commissioner Janet Walsh, recipient of $25,000 in campaign contributions from Victoria's husband, suddenly announced an emergency review of my water rights claims. Serious questions exist about Mr. Reed's mental fitness to control critical community resources, Walsh declared during a hastily scheduled press conference. We're exploring emergency municipal acquisition to protect public safety. Pure political corruption wrapped in public health rhetoric. But Victoria's most dangerous gambit came Friday evening when my phone rang with a call that made my blood freeze. "Mr. Reed?" The voice was professional, clinical. "This is Dr. Amanda Foster from Child Protective Services. We've received reports that you've been making threats against children in the Whispering Oaks community." My stomach dropped into my boots. Victoria had weaponized CPS against me. "There must be some mistake," I said, gripping the phone hard enough to crack plastic. "I don't have children. I've never threatened anyone's kids." "Sir, we have sworn statements claiming you told multiple parents their children would pay the price for their community's actions against your property. We need to schedule an immediate wellness evaluation." The taste of pure rage was copper and electricity. Victoria had crossed every line of human decency. But here's where her plan backfired spectacularly. Dr. Foster mentioned the complainant's name during our call. Sandra Mills, the same health inspector who'd admitted finding no violations on my ranch. When I told Dr. Foster about Sandra's conflict of interest and her tennis partnership with Victoria, the tone of our conversation changed completely. "Mr. Reed," Dr. Foster said after a long pause, "would you be willing to provide documentation about Ms. Mills's previous false reports regarding your property?" 20 minutes later, I was emailing Dr. Foster the recordings of Sandra admitting Victoria had threatened her job unless she found violations. CPS doesn't appreciate being used as a weapon in civil disputes, and Victoria had just made a federal enemy. That's when Deputy Marcus showed up at my door looking like he'd been hit by a freight train. The poor bastard was caught between family loyalty and basic human decency, and the stress was literally killing him. "Dalton," he said, collapsing into my kitchen chair like his bones had turned to jelly. "She's lost her damn mind. Completely lost it." The coffee I poured him sat untouched as he revealed Victoria's nuclear option. "Tomorrow she's staging a protest rally at the county courthouse," Marcus whispered, glancing around like Victoria might be listening through the walls. "But it's not just protesters. She's hired actors from Dallas to pose as sick children and grieving parents. Fake victims claiming your ranch poisoned their families." The audacity was breathtaking. Victoria was literally staging a fake humanitarian crisis to steal my water rights. "There's more," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "She's planning to have one of the fake kids collapse during the rally. Ambulances, media coverage, the whole production. She wants footage of a dying child to force emergency government seizure of your property." And that's when I realized Victoria Pemberton wasn't just corrupt, she was genuinely evil. She was willing to traumatize real children and exploit fake medical emergencies to avoid paying for water access. As Marcus left, his patrol car taillights disappearing into the darkness, I understood that tomorrow's rally wouldn't just be Victoria's last stand. It would be her complete destruction. And I was going to enjoy watching her burn. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of Texas heat that makes asphalt shimmer, and Victoria's desperation reached levels that would have impressed Satan himself. The fake protest was set for 10 a.m. at the county courthouse, but Victoria's real show started at dawn when she violated her federal bail conditions by showing up drunk at my property line with a crew of hired thugs. I was feeding my cattle when I heard the rumble of diesel engines, not the familiar sound of ranch equipment, but the aggressive growl of modified pickup trucks. Through the morning mist rising off my pasture, I watched 5 vehicles park along my fence line, disgorging men who looked like they'd been recruited from a motorcycle gang casting call. Victoria emerged from the lead truck wearing designer sunglasses and carrying what appeared to be a baseball bat. Even from 50 yards away, I could smell the alcohol on the morning breeze mixing with the sweet scent of dewdrops on bluebonnets. "Reed!" she screamed, her voice slurred and shrill enough to spook my cattle. "You think you can destroy my life? You think you can ruin everything I built?" The hired muscles spread out along my fence like they were preparing for war. One of them, a massive guy with prison tattoos covering his neck, started filming with his phone while Victoria launched into a performance that belonged in a psychiatric ward. "This is my land now," she shrieked, swinging the bat at my fence posts. "I made this community. I brought civilization to this backwards wasteland. You're nothing but trailer trash playing rancher." But here's what Victoria didn't know. I'd been expecting this visit. After Marcus's warning, I'd contacted Jennifer Walsh at Channel 7, and her news crew was positioned in the tree line with cameras rolling, capturing every second of Victoria's meltdown for the evening broadcast. The mini twist came when Victoria's hired thugs started cutting my fence wire. "Ma'am," one of them called out, "maybe we should—" "Cut it all!" Victoria screamed, taking another swing at a fence post. "He's got no right to keep us out. This water belongs to the community." That's when I triggered the surprise I'd been preparing all week. With a flip of my smartphone, I activated the new security system Tommy had helped me install. Motion-activated sprinklers loaded with harmless but foul-smelling liquid fertilizer. The system I'd originally designed for keeping deer out of my garden worked perfectly on human pests. The thugs went from intimidating to soaked in fish emulsion in about 3 seconds, stumbling around like drowned rats while Victoria shrieked at them to keep cutting fence. But the real shock came when Sheriff Patricia Williams arrived with a full tactical team, not to arrest me, but to serve Victoria with federal warrants. "Victoria Pemberton," Sheriff Williams announced, her voice carrying across the pasture with absolute authority, "you're under arrest for violation of federal bail conditions, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to commit environmental fraud." Victoria's bat clattered to the ground as federal marshals emerged from unmarked vehicles I hadn't even noticed. Turns out my morning entertainment was also a federal sting operation designed to catch Victoria violating her bail terms. "This is entrapment," Victoria screamed as they cuffed her. "He set me up! Reed orchestrated this whole thing." Actually, I had. After Marcus warned me about the fake protest, I'd contacted the FBI and suggested they might want to monitor Victoria's activities. Desperate criminals make stupid mistakes, and I'd just given her enough rope to hang herself. But Victoria's nuclear meltdown was just getting started. "You want to know the truth about your precious rancher?" she screamed at the news cameras as they dragged her toward the patrol car. "He's been poisoning his own cattle for months, creating fake environmental reports. The contamination is coming from his property, not ours." The lies poured out of her like toxic waste from a ruptured pipeline. She accused me of everything from insurance fraud to domestic terrorism, each claim more desperate than the last. "He killed his own grandfather," she shrieked, spittle flying from her mouth. "Poisoned him with contaminated water to inherit the ranch. Check the autopsy reports." Even the federal marshals looked uncomfortable as Victoria's psychotic break reached its crescendo. "I built something beautiful here," she wailed, her designer clothes now stained with fish fertilizer and morning dew. "These people were nothing before I came, living in trailers and poverty. I gave them civilization." As they loaded Victoria into the federal transport vehicle, her final words echoed across my pasture like the dying screams of a banshee. "You'll never win. I'll burn this whole county down before I let trailer trash defeat me." The morning air suddenly felt clean and sweet as the federal convoy disappeared down my gravel road, taking Victoria Pemberton out of my life forever. The taste of victory was as refreshing as spring water on a hot day. Jennifer Walsh approached with her camera crew, grinning like Christmas morning. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I think we just filmed the most spectacular public meltdown in Texas history. Mind if we get your reaction to Mrs. Pemberton's performance?" I looked out over my grandfather's land, where cattle grazed peacefully beside the spring that had fed 4 generations of my family. "No comment," I said. "The water speaks for itself." Victoria's fake protest turned into the most spectacular public humiliation in Texas courthouse history, and I had front row seats to watch her empire crumble into radioactive dust. By 10 a.m., the courthouse square was packed with 300 people, but not the sympathetic crowd Victoria had expected. Word of her morning arrest had spread faster than wildfire, and half the audience had come just to watch her hired actors perform their fake medical emergency routine without their director. The scene was pure chaos. Victoria's Dallas-imported protesters stood around looking confused while real Whispering Oaks residents showed up demanding answers about their poisoned water and collapsed property values. Local news crews outnumbered actual protesters 3-1, and every camera was focused on the growing crowd of genuinely angry homeowners. Sheriff Williams had released Victoria on emergency bail just so she could attend her own political funeral, but she arrived looking like she'd been hit by a freight train. Her usual designer armor was replaced by wrinkled clothes and smeared makeup, and she moved with the jerky desperation of someone whose world was disintegrating in real time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria called out, her voice hoarse from screaming, "we're here today because a dangerous man is holding our community hostage." But the crowd wasn't buying her performance anymore. Someone shouted, "What about our poisoned water?" Another voice demanded, "Where's our money for cleanup?" That's when County Commissioner Janet Walsh stepped to the microphone and the political earthquake hit with devastating force. "Citizens," Walsh announced, her face pale as courthouse marble, "I've just received a federal court order mandating immediate disclosure of all communications between my office and the Pemberton HOA regarding water rights acquisition." She pulled out a thick folder that looked like a legal death sentence. These documents show that Mrs. Pemberton offered substantial campaign contributions in exchange for municipal seizure of private water rights. This constitutes bribery of public officials under Texas law. The crowd erupted. Flash bulbs exploded like artillery fire as reporters realized they were witnessing the biggest political corruption scandal in county history. But Victoria's response was pure, unhinged desperation. "Those documents are fabricated," she shrieked, grabbing the microphone with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Reed has been manipulating evidence for months. He's the real criminal here." That's when I stepped forward, carrying the briefcase that contained every piece of evidence I'd gathered during our 6-month war. "Mrs. Pemberton," I said, my voice carrying across the courthouse square with hydraulic engineer precision, "would you like to explain to these families why you concealed toxic contamination for 3 years while their children drank poisoned water?" I opened the briefcase and pulled out EPA contamination reports, federal investigation documents, and audio recordings of Victoria's environmental cover-up. The papers rustled in the morning breeze like the wings of justice finally taking flight. "These are EPA findings showing your subdivision sits on illegally dumped industrial waste," I announced, holding up photographs that looked like scenes from environmental hell. "Heavy metals, petroleum compounds, chromium. Your neighbors have been living on a toxic dump while you tried to steal clean water to cover up your crimes." The crowd's anger shifted from confused protest to focused fury. These weren't paid actors anymore. These were real families who'd discovered their HOA president had been slowly poisoning them for years. "That's not true!" Victoria screamed, but her voice was drowned out by 200 voices demanding answers about contaminated soil, poisoned wells, and children's health problems that suddenly made sense. County Judge Patricia Williams stepped to the microphone with the authority of 30 years on the bench. Mrs. Pemberton, you're hereby served with a federal grand jury subpoena for environmental crimes, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of the federal RICO Act. The final blow came when Dr. Sarah Caspian from the EPA approached the microphone carrying evidence files that looked thick enough to build a house. "Citizens of Whispering Oaks," Dr. Caspian announced, "the federal government is establishing a victim compensation fund for environmental contamination damage. Mrs. Pemberton and her co-conspirators face criminal liability exceeding $12 million. That's when Victoria completely snapped. "You're all idiots!" she shrieked into the microphone, her voice echoing off the courthouse walls like a banshee's death wail. "I tried to save this community. I brought culture and standards to this backwards wasteland. You deserve to live in filth." The crowd went dead silent as Victoria's mask finally fell completely away, revealing the entitled monster underneath. "I could have made this place matter," she continued, spittle flying from her mouth. "But you're all too stupid to appreciate civilization, too ignorant to understand progress." Federal marshals were already moving toward the podium as Victoria delivered her final mic-drop moment of self-destruction. "I hope you all drink poison water forever," she screamed. "You deserve every ounce of suffering you get." As they dragged her away in handcuffs for the second time in one day, the courthouse square erupted in applause that echoed off the limestone buildings like thunder. Justice had finally come to Victoria Pemberton, and it tasted sweeter than spring water on a hot Texas day. The morning I turned on the master valve and cut water to 400 homes, I expected to feel satisfaction. What I didn't expect was the phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Reed?" The voice was young, scared. "This is Amanda Peterson from Whispering Oaks. My mom is on dialysis, and we just lost water pressure. Could you please help us?" That's when I realized revenge tastes bitter when innocent people suffer for their leaders' crimes. Within 2 hours, I'd restored partial water service to homes with medical needs, elderly residents, and families with small children. Victoria's sins weren't their fault, and my grandfather didn't raise me to punish the innocent for the guilty's crimes. The conversation that followed between me and the new HOA leadership was tense but honest. They were facing $2.8 million in cleanup costs, federal criminal charges against their former president, and property values that had cratered below the toxic soil line. But they were also desperate families who needed clean water to survive. The water lease agreement we negotiated became a model for environmental justice across Texas. I provide clean water at cost, no profit margin, with all excess revenue funding the Hill Country Water Conservation Trust that now protects 10,400 acres of groundwater resources. Victoria Pemberton received 12 years in federal prison for environmental crimes and conspiracy. Her husband got 8 years for financial fraud. The judge called their scheme environmental terrorism motivated by sociopathic greed, and the sentence sent shockwaves through HOA boardrooms statewide. But the real victory came from what we built together. The former Whispering Oaks subdivision underwent complete environmental remediation, removing 400 tons of contaminated soil and replacing it with native prairie restoration. The Mockingbird Nature Preserve now sits where McMansions once poisoned the earth, attracting 15,000 visitors annually to learn about groundwater protection and sustainable development. Dr. Sarah Caspian left the EPA to become our conservation director, and her research lab has developed water conservation techniques that protect rural communities across the Southwest. The visitor center sits where Victoria's mansion once stood, housing exhibits about environmental crimes and how communities can fight back against corporate contamination. My personal transformation surprised everyone, including myself. Dr. Maria Santos and I married last spring beside the natural spring where Grandpa taught me that water was sacred. She moved her hydrological research operation to the ranch, and together we're developing conservation technologies that could protect agricultural communities from future development pressure. The wedding drew 200 guests, including every ranching family in 3 counties, plus the federal agents who brought Victoria to justice. Even Marcus attended, finally free from his toxic family obligations and working as security director for our conservation trust. Tommy Crawford's law practice now specializes in defending rural landowners against HOA overreach, using our case as legal precedent. He's won 23 similar battles across Texas, and other states are adopting our strategies to protect agricultural heritage from suburban colonization. The annual Mockingbird Water Festival celebrates Texas water heritage every July 4th weekend, with 5,000 visitors enjoying live music, environmental education, and barbecue that would make angels weep. Local businesses have seen tourism revenue increase 400% since Victoria's empire became a conservation success story. But the most meaningful victory involves the families Victoria victimized. All 1,200 displaced residents received full federal compensation plus relocation assistance. Many chose to stay in our area, building homes in genuinely sustainable developments that respect both environment and local culture. The children who drank contaminated water receive comprehensive medical monitoring through a federal health program, and early intervention has prevented long-term health consequences. Every morning I walk out to check the spring where Grandpa scattered corn for wild birds, and cattle drank water so pure it sparkled like liquid diamonds. The flow remains steady at 50 gallons per minute, fed by an aquifer that will outlast every subdivision and every entitled developer who thinks they can steal what belongs to the earth. Duke, Buster's grandson, has inherited his grandfather's talent for protecting the ranch and chasing armadillos. His favorite spot is beside Grandpa's memorial stone, which anchors the most visited section of our preserve where thousands learn about environmental protection annually. Share your own HOA horror stories in the comments below. I read every single one. These battles happen everywhere, and rural families need to know they're not fighting alone. Subscribe for next week's story about my neighbor who turned his garage into a fortress when the city tried to steal his vintage Mustang collection. Trust me, that revenge involves more explosions and even sweeter justice.